Today we're going to be talking about everything that you need to know about part 1 of the IELTS speaking test. Now, understanding how the speaking test works is hugely important. Over the years I've met many candidates, and the first time I meet them I often have quite a good idea of how they're going to perform based on their speaking level when we first meet. But many times I meet candidates who I think are going to do okay, and they perform very badly under test conditions. The reason is not their speaking ability, it's their awareness of the exam and their expectations of what's going to happen. Part 1 is the first part of the test, and it's so important that we get that bit right. It sets the tone for everything that's going to follow. So let's take a look at this vital first section of the speaking test. The very start of the speaking test is not actually part of part 1. So at the beginning of the test, just after you sit down to talk to the examiner, you'll be asked a series of questions. Your name, what would you like to be called? You'll have to show your identification, the examiner will tell you their name, things like this. None of that is assessed. Okay, so that's not part of part 1. You may feel like you're in the test, but the test hasn't actually started. So what is part 1? Well, part 1 lasts for about 4.5 minutes, and it will be the examiner asking you questions about yourself. The questions are designed to be the kind of question that anyone, anywhere in the world can answer. So they're not designed to be difficult or catch you out. You don't need any specialist knowledge or anything like this. It will just be about you. Your life, where you live, the things you do, the things you like, the things you dislike, your past memories, things like this. There will never be anything more complex than that. The test is designed so that anyone, anywhere in the world can answer any question. They are not testing your knowledge, they're testing your language ability. So in some ways, it's designed to be an easy introduction to the rest of the test. It should be the easiest part in terms of the kind of questions that you are asked. Another aspect is that, of course, the exam designers are aware that this is the first part of the test for you, and so they want to kind of get you warmed up and relaxed, talking about easier topics and easier areas before you move on to the more specialist or targeted questions later on in the test. So, in theory, part 1 should be the easiest part of the assessment. So how is part 1 organised? Well, it's actually very simple. The examiner is going to give you 3 different sets of questions. These are called a frame in IELTS terminology. Each frame will be on a different topic and will have around 4 questions. The topics will all be a little bit different from each other. The examiner has the freedom to choose the topics to a degree, but they will choose them before they begin their test with you. So you can't influence the topics in any way. But they will be chosen to be slightly different from each other, so that you're going to be using different vocabulary to talk about each one. The very first frame, or the very first set of questions that you will be given, will be about one of 2 topics. It will either be about your home. Now that could be the building that you live in. It could be your home district, your home city, something like this. It could be about your bedroom. It could be about anything to do with your home. Or it will be about work or study. It will begin with, do you work or are you a student? You can answer that, and then there will be either a series of questions about your studies and your life at school or university, or they will be about your job. And you can answer either. So that will always be the first frame. So you will always begin with a very predictable, familiar topic, either your home or your work or studies. And there'll be 3 or 4 questions about that. After that, the examiner will move on to another frame. They will say, now let's talk about, and they will give the new topic. Let's say the topic is bicycles. The examiner will begin by saying, now let's talk about bicycles. Did you learn to ride a bicycle when you were a child? Or something like this. And they will just move straight into the first question in that topic. As we said before, the areas that these topics can come from are quite varied, but they will all be about you, your life, or your personal experiences. I've seen a wide range of question types over the years. You may have frames about what you like to do at the weekend. Maybe it's about clothes that you own. Maybe it's about places that you have visited. I've seen frames about the countryside, about beaches, about street markets. They could be a little bit more abstract. You could have a frame about a certain type of experience, perhaps a frame about driving in a car, or, as we said before, bicycles or something like this. There's a very wide range. But as we said at the start of the video, the questions are supposed to be designed so that anyone, anywhere in the world can answer them. So structurally, we will have these 3 frames. So that means you're going to have a maximum of about 12 questions, but it's very unlikely that you will get to 12 questions. The examiner will probably run out of time. The total length of part 1 is about 4.5 minutes. And the examiner will finish the questions in one topic area, then move on to another, finish their question in that area, and then do as many of the final area as there is time for. There may not be time to finish all of the questions, and it doesn't matter. So the structure is very, very simple. 3 topic areas and about 4 questions in each one. There is a little bit of variation. Whenever I'm asked questions about how to respond to the questions you get in part 1 of the assessment, I always begin with the same piece of advice, because it answers most of the questions you probably have about part 1 of the speaking test. That advice is, treat it like a conversation or a chat. The more like a friendly conversation the assessment is, the more likely you are to perform well. Of course, the exam is very, very structured in terms of what the examiner is doing, and they will do things like interrupt you, but that doesn't matter. The main thing is try to make it as much like a conversation as possible. So a lot of the questions that you probably have can be answered by this. So for example, the most common question people will ask me is, what if I don't know the answer to the question? Well then, what would you do in a conversation? You say you don't know the answer to the question. So for example, if the topic is cars, and they say, do you like to drive a car? Perhaps you are too young to drive a car. Well then tell them. Say, I don't know what it's like to drive a car because I'm not old enough to try yet. However, I think I would probably enjoy it in the future. Or again, an answer to the same question that you don't know is maybe you're an adult and you don't know how to drive a car. Tell them. Say, actually, I don't know what it's like to drive a car because I can't drive. That's a perfectly acceptable response to the question. If you respond the same way you would in a conversation, you are much more likely to do well. The examiner doesn't care what you say. There is no correct answer. You don't have to say yes to every question. If the answer is no or I don't know, That's absolutely fine. It doesn't matter. The examiner will just be assessing your language in your response. So in answer to the most common question I get, what if I don't know the answer to the question? It doesn't matter. The next most common question that I'm asked about for part 1 is, what if I have nothing to say? Again, it comes back to that same principle. If you treat it like a conversation, that will answer the question. So in a conversation between you and a friend, if you ask your friend a question and your friend just says, no, or I don't know, kind of kills the conversation, doesn't it? It doesn't feel natural. So think about what you would do. If your friend asks you a question and you don't know the answer, well, what you will do is you will probably just tell them that. So let's take the example from before about driving cars. If the examiner asks you, do you like to drive a car? If you have nothing to say to that, you can just say, to be honest, I don't really go in cars very often. It's not really part of my life. Or I live in an area where not many people drive cars, so I don't really have any experience of that. That's fine. The response doesn't need to be incredibly long as it is an effective answer to the question. And if an effective answer to the question is, I don't really know about that, and a reason why you don't know, that's absolutely fine. It will be long enough for the examiner to move on to the next question. Now, sometimes your responses can be too long. Remember, the examiner is on a very tight schedule for each part of the exam. So they only have a certain amount of time they can let you speak. So this is one of the areas where it is not like a real conversation. Sometimes if you're talking for too long on a topic, the examiner will say, thank you, and then move on and ask you another question. If this happens, don't worry. It is just because the examiner must keep to a strict time schedule. So if you're speaking for a long time and the examiner interrupts you, don't worry. In fact, it's probably quite a good sign. Okay, so don't worry if the examiner interrupts you or if you're speaking for too long. On average, I would say a good part 1 answer is probably about 5 or 6 sentences long. Now, if you think about how long it takes for most of us to say 5 or 6 sentences, it's about 30 seconds. So even if sometimes your responses are short, maybe you don't know the answer, so you just give 2 sentences, one sentence saying you don't really have anything to say about that and another reason why. To be honest, I don't really know much about driving cars. I live in an area where most people don't have them, so I don't have much experience. That's fine for a shorter answer. And then on other questions, which you have more to say, maybe you speak until the examiner tells you to stop. This is the kind of range of responses that we will have in part 1. So to summarize, don't worry if you don't have any ideas. Just tell the examiner why you don't have any ideas or you don't have any experience in that area, and the examiner will move on. Don't worry about talking for too long. The examiner will just tell you to stop when they run out of time for that question. The next question that I'm often asked can also be answered by treating the exam as much like a conversation as possible. Several times I've been asked, can I just memorize my answers before the test begins? For example, I know they're going to ask me about my home. Can I just memorize a speech about my home or my work or my studies and then give them that prepared speech? Surely that way I can show good vocabulary, perfect grammar, and make sure my pronunciation is clearer. It comes back to the same thing. In a conversation, if somebody asks you a question and you give a prepared response, that's not very good, is it? It's the same in the assessment. If you do give a prepared response, the examiner will be able to know it's not natural speech, it's not part of a conversation. They will acknowledge some elements of your pronunciation and things like this, but they will also acknowledge that it is a prepared response and it is not necessarily going to respond to the exact question. So if let's say you try to memorize a response about your home and you talk about your apartment. What about if the examiner asks you about your home district? Perhaps they ask about the neighbors who live near your home. All of a sudden, your prepared response about your apartment is useless. If you try to use it in the assessment, it will result in a poor score. So, do not pre-prepare or memorize your answers. Treat the exam like a conversation. This is how to get the highest scores. So if you remember one thing only as you're preparing for the first part of the IELTS speaking assessment, it's this. Treat the exam as much like a conversation between friends as possible. If you do this, you'll probably perform quite well. Apart from treating it like a conversation, I do have a couple of useful tips for you that can help you in part 1. The first tip is about grammar. As you will probably know, grammar and your sentence structures is one of the criteria that the examiner is assessing you on. Remember, the exam designers want this to be real, natural language use. And the problem for them of this kind of questions about your daily life is that it doesn't require a wide range of grammar structures. So what they do is they will include a certain number of questions which require you to, actually a better phrase is, give you the chance to use a wider range of grammar. It gives you the chance to show the examiner that you can use a wider range of grammar effectively. So my first tip is, as you're practicing speaking questions, try to notice when these questions are asking for you to talk about the past and your experiences, or they're asking about your plans, or things like this, because it will give you the opportunity to practice switching the grammar you use. It's one of the things that the examiners will look out for when they're formulating their grammatical range and accuracy scores. So that's an easy tip. Try to recognize when we have these grammar shifts in the questions. There will probably be 1, maybe 2 in each of the 3 frames that you look at. My other tip for part 1 is perhaps the most important. And that is to think about stress and nervousness. Part 1 isn't hard. The questions are easy. They're the kind of questions that you learn to answer at the very start of primary school, or whenever it is you first started to learn English. They are very basic. The difficulty isn't coming from the questions. The difficulty comes from being in the exam environment. It is stressful. It doesn't matter how well prepared you are probably going to feel quite nervous when you begin your assessment. And because part 1 is the very start of the test, this is where stress and nerves can impact your performance the most. In my experience, most IELTS candidates do not perform at 100% of their ability in the test. When I try to prepare people for the test, our target is if we can get you speaking at 80 or 90% of your maximum ability, I will be very, very happy. The stressful environment can have a huge impact on your score. Now, if we talk about all of the different approaches you can use to deal with stress and to prepare for this stressful speaking exam environment, this video will be 4 hours long, maybe longer. So we're not going to talk about them here. So my advice is prepare. You must accept that you are going to be performing below your maximum ability. You are going to be speaking in an uncomfortable environment. And there are different things you can do to prepare. The important thing is that you do something to get yourself ready for this aspect. It's not about language, it's not about fluency or vocabulary or grammar or any of the other things the examiner is assessing. It is about you and how you respond to difficult situations. To wrap things up, part 1 of the speaking assessment will be a conversation between you and the examiner where you talk about yourself, your experiences, and the world around you. There will be 3 sets of questions with a maximum of about 12. You're probably going to be speaking on average for about 30 seconds per answer. If some of them are a little bit shorter or a little bit longer, that's fine. It doesn't matter. The important thing is treat it like a conversation. Try to make your interactions as natural as possible and you will perform as well as possible. Finally, be prepared to be stressed and uncomfortable in the assessment. It is going to happen. It's highly unlikely that you will feel 100% relaxed in your test, so get ready for it. Now, in future videos, we will be looking at some of the techniques that you can use to help reduce your stress levels and produce a better performance even when you are feeling stressed or under pressure. We'll also be looking at the different aspects of the speaking assessment as well as the assessment criteria, so you know exactly what it is the examiners are looking for when they give you their scores. But until then, I wish you all the very best in your IELTS assessment preparations.